Welcome to this fifth tutorial in the Mongoose Fundamentals video training series. In this tutorial, we will be talking about licensing and security mechanisms for Mongoose, what is included in a Mongoose license and how to apply it, assigning licensed modules to users, editing permissions and what they mean for users, individual and group authorizations and what they mean for users. And we will show you how to create a user ID profile before giving you the chance to create one yourself. In a sense, licensing and security measures in Mongoose can be considered to be two sides of the same coin. They are both required for a fully functional system, and they work together to do the job. Let's take a look first at the licensing side of the coin. Licensing is the first line of defense in keeping a Mongoose environment safe and fully functional. Without proper licensing, nobody can really accomplish anything. There are two types of resources in Mongoose that can be licensed, forms and IDOs. To have a fully functional development environment, you need both types. The license itself then consists of counts of licensed modules. There are currently 6 Mongoose license modules, which we will look at more closely in a minute. Each license module contains access rights to a set of forms or IDOs or both, depending on what it is to be used for and who it is to be used by. There are 3 basic types of licenses that are issued and used with Mongoose. For core functionality, in other words, for you to be able to use the Mongoose software to build and deploy Mongoose-based applications, Infor defines and issues the license based on a contractual agreement. We will look at exactly how this license is issued and applied here in a minute. For Infor applications such as Sightline that are built on the Mongoose framework, Infor issues licenses with license modules that contain both the Mongoose core forms and IDOs, as well as the application-specific forms and IDOs. For any Mongoose-based applications you might build then and want to sell and/or distribute to others, you define the license and register your application with Infor, and then Infor creates licenses for you to distribute, again based on a contractual agreement. Okay then, so let's take a closer look at the license that Infor issues to you to use the Mongoose software. The first thing you need to know is that before you can sign into Mongoose with a user ID other than the SA user login that we have already seen, you must obtain and apply the Infor license. Without a license applied, no other user login other than SA works. After you come to an agreement with Infor regarding the terms of your contract, Infor issues the license file according to the terms of the contract. You must then apply the license to your Mongoose installation using the process we are about to demonstrate, regardless of which basic type of license you have purchased. The license file is an encrypted text file, typically sent as an email attachment. When you receive it, you must use the license management form in Mongoose to apply the license. The first tab of this form displays information about what licensed modules are already installed for Mongoose, if any. The third tab is where you actually apply the license you have received. You must be logged in as SA, and then you simply copy the entire contents of the text file, paste it into the field provided on the Apply License tab, and click Apply License. In passing, we should mention the middle tab on the license management form, the Multi-Session Users tab. The users you create can only have one active session in a given Mongoose application. In some cases, such as a web page with anonymous guest login though, you will need multi-session users. These are defined as part of your license key, as requested from Infor. If your license contains multi-session users, they are displayed on this tab after you apply your license. A Mongoose license can be either a named user license or a concurrent user license. Typically, pricing for these two types differs depending on which kind you purchase. The license Infor issues to you is then a named or concurrent license. For a named user license, Mongoose enforces the limit of license module usage at the point at which you grant license modules to your users. For example, if you purchased a license which contains 6 MG Core Trans license modules, if you attempt to grant a 7th user the MG Core Trans module, Mongoose displays an error message. For a concurrent user license, you can assign a given license module to as many users as you want. Mongoose enforces the licensing when users log in based on the current usage of that module. As we mentioned earlier, when you buy Mongoose to develop your own applications, your license includes 6 license modules which contain the core Mongoose forms and IDOs. Other Mongoose-based applications might include and use these 6 plus their own license modules, or they might have their own application-specific sets of modules that contain the core Mongoose forms and IDOs. The MG Core Trans license module is without a doubt the most commonly used license module. This module provides access to the basic core operational forms that nearly all users will require access to. Because it is typically assigned to all system users, you can restrict access to forms and IDOs using group and individual user authorization settings. More on that in a few minutes here. The MG Core Automation license module provides access to just the core IDOs. Use this license when you want to grant access to just the IDOs in your system by external applications. This access can be based on a broad variety of web and other technologies, including SOAP, .NET class libraries, XML via HTTP, and COM. The MG DataViews license module provides access to and use of those forms that make use of data views and critical numbers functionality. If you plan to use this functionality in your forms and applications, you will need this license module. The MG Developer license module is designed for users who are form and application developers. It provides access to specialized forms used only for form and application development work, such as the IDO editing forms and the SQL table-related forms. This user module is typically assigned only to users who have site developer or vendor developer editing permissions. As you develop new forms and IDOs, they are automatically assigned to the MG User-Created Forms and MG User-Created IDOs modules. So, for users to be able to access those forms and IDOs that you have created, you must grant them access to these license modules. Before we move on to talk about the security features built into Mongoose, we must say a word or two about the SA user login. As you are aware, so far we have only this one user login with which to access the Mongoose software. One of the first things you should do as soon as you have your Mongoose software installed, configured, and licensed is to create appropriate user login profiles so that you do not have to continue using the SA login. The SA login has special privileges attached, like being able to access any form and any data, regardless of licensing or authorization. So, you should reserve the SA login to administrators only and not for routine development use. We will go ahead and show you how to create a user login profile before we finish here, but first let's talk a little about the other security measures built into Mongoose, the other side of the coin. The security measures built into Mongoose include 2 basic mechanisms: editing permissions, which we have already mentioned, and authorizations, both for individual users and for user groups. Let's look first at editing permissions. This is a user attribute that determines whether the user has access to the form designer, which we call design mode, and if so, what types of changes they can make to forms. When you create a user profile in Mongoose, you must assign to each user a specific level of editing permissions. There are 5 levels. The level of editing permissions with the least amount of form customization capabilities is designated None. This setting disables design mode altogether. Note that users with this designation can perform very limited changes to forms for their own use. These are called runtime form changes, and they include such things as changing the size of the form, changing the width, visibility, and sequence of columns within a grid, changing the position of a splitter bar, and so on. These runtime form changes can be made by any Mongoose user. Those with editing permissions of None, however, cannot use design mode in Mongoose to make more extensive changes, either for their own use or anyone else's. They can only make runtime form changes. Those with editing permissions of Basic can go into and use design mode, but only to make minor changes that do not require development training, cannot break the functionality of a form, and which affect only their own use and view of a form. No one else can see or use them. The next level of editing permissions is full user. A full user can also go into design mode and can make pretty much any modifications or customizations they want to a form. But, like the basic user, the changes they make to forms are for their own use only. They cannot make changes to forms for other users to see and use, and they cannot create or delete forms. There are two levels of editing permissions designed specifically for developers. The first is the site developer level. Site developers can use design mode to modify or customize forms not only for their own use, but they can also make modifications and customizations for other users, either on an individual basis, on a user group basis, or on a site-wide basis. In addition, site developers can create and delete forms, use form control to check forms and IDOs in and out, and they can create and modify public and user folders in the Mongoose Explorer. The last level of editing permissions then, vendor developer, is used if you are building an application for resale. When this is the case, and you are developing new forms that your users or customers will be able to extend and customize, this level of editing permissions allows you to create your forms and applications in a way that will automatically upgrade when you deploy new versions. In most respects, the vendor developer is the same as a site developer, but with a few key exceptions. Forms and IDOs created by vendor developers are classified as vendor default versions. This allows them to be bundled and distributed to others, along with the Mongoose core forms and IDOs. Vendor developers can access and modify only vendor default versions of forms and IDOs. They cannot view or modify versions customized at the site, group, or user levels. Vendor developers cannot see, create, or modify public and user folders in the Mongoose Explorer, but they can create and modify entries in the Master Explorer, which site developers cannot do. So, when you go to create your user profiles for your users, you must think carefully about what levels of editing permissions they are going to need and make sure that their user profiles have the correct editing permission level assigned. After licensing and editing permissions, the third most important mechanism for controlling access and providing system security is authorizations. For nearly all user IDs, some kind of authorization is required in addition to licensing. Without authorizations, users cannot access forms or IDOs even if they are licensed to and have the correct editing permissions. Authorizations allow access to forms and IDOs both on an individual user basis and a user group basis. We'll take a look shortly at how both these types of authorizations are granted. Authorizations include options to deny access to a form or IDO altogether, allow read-only access, meaning users can look at forms but not make changes to the data in them, or have full access to both view and modify the data on forms. There are two exceptions to these basic authorization rules. The SA user has full access to all forms and IDOs without limit, and a user can be designated super user, which bypasses any other authorizations you might or might not define for them. Before we show you how to set all this up for a user profile, let's take a closer look at that super user designation. Super users are designated as such by selecting the super user checkbox on the user's form. Any user who is designated as a super user then has full access to any form that belongs to a licensed module to which they are assigned. You should note, however, that unlike the SA user, the super user must be licensed before accessing any forms. And without super user status, every user must be both licensed and authorized to access any forms or IDOs. But we mentioned the super user designation because it is very useful for most developer user IDs to have, just not end users. We mentioned before that there are two basic types of authorizations for users. They can be granted on an individual basis or on the basis of membership in a user group. Individual user authorizations can be the most specific. They allow you to determine authorizations on a form-by-form, IDO-by-IDO basis for each user. And they allow you to determine for each form whether they are denied access, have read-only access, or have full access. But if you have many users, and if many of them need similar kinds of access based on location, job function, or organizational role, for example, then it can be much easier and more efficient to define and employ user groups. This means that you can assign authorizations for a range of forms and access levels to the group as a whole, and then each member of that group automatically has those authorizations. For example, suppose you have several employees all working in the purchasing department, and they all need access basically only to the forms used for purchasing activities. You could create a user group called Purchasing that provides full access to those forms only. Then, by assigning a user to be a member of that user group, that user automatically has access to the purchasing activity forms. Then, if you need to make exceptions to the group rules for a particular user, all you have to do is open that user's profile and make the changes on an individual user basis. To make life easier for the Mongoose system administrator, Infor provides 4 ready-made user groups that can be used as defaults or used as the basis for your own user groups. The Core Forms admin group has been designed for system administrators to use. It allows access to the forms needed to administer a working Mongoose system. We designed the Core Forms developer group specifically for form and application developers to use. This user group provides access to the forms specifically created for form and application development work, basically the SQL table and IDO editing forms. The Core Forms end user should be adequate for most end users. This group provides access to more common everyday use core forms that end users would need to do their work. And finally, the Core IDOs group is designed to provide access to the core IDOs in Mongoose, mostly intended for user profiles designed to provide access from web services or other external applications. You should be aware that you can also create your own user groups. In fact, we strongly recommend that you do. This is the best way to optimize the Mongoose system for your organization's use. As we said before, you can base user groups on location of the users, their job roles, membership in a department, or whatever else makes sense in your situation. That's the beauty of creating your own user groups. You can customize them for your own needs. User groups help you to identify and define who needs access to what, create user ID profiles easier and faster, and provide the maximum amount of security and control over access to your Mongoose system. Finally, at both the group and user level, the Mongoose security system allows you to define field-level authorizations and row-level authorizations. For example, you can hide fields that contain salary information for a group of users, or you can restrict a list of sales orders to the region in which a group of sales representatives are located. Okay, well, we've hit you with a whole lot of information here. To help you put it all together and see how it works out in practice, let's do a quick demonstration of how to create a user ID profile. And then we'll give you the chance to create a couple users of your own. As you saw earlier, we have already obtained and applied a Mongoose license on our development system, so that much is already done. To create a user ID then, we must start out by signing in to Mongoose as SA, since that is the only user ID we currently have. Once we are signed in, we must open the users form. We'll show you alternate ways to open forms in the next tutorial, but for now we will just click the open icon. This opens the Select Form dialog box. We will scroll down until we find the form named Users Maint. Notice that its caption is Users. We will select that form and then click OK. When the user's form opens, initially it displays no data. This is because it opens in what we call filter in place mode. We'll have much more to say about this in the next tutorial as well. For now, we'll just point out that Mongoose is prompting you for what filter criteria you want to use in order to retrieve your data. So we need to tell Mongoose to query our user data without doing any filtering by simply clicking the Filter in Place icon. When we do that, notice that there is currently only one user ID in the system, the SA login that comes with the system. We want to create a new user ID, so we will click the New icon. This action creates a new blank record. The first thing we must provide is a name for the user ID. Because we want to use this user ID as a vendor developer to create and customize forms and IDOs, we will call this user IT Vendor Dev. We use IT to designate that it is for the issue tracking application we are planning to develop, and Vendor Dev to indicate what kind of editing permissions the user is to have. This brings up a point that you should consider carefully, and that is, how do you want to identify or name your users? In most cases, in a real-world situation, we recommend simply using the user's first initial and last name. Or you could use an employee ID number, or whatever. But you will want to come up with a naming convention that works for you, and then stick with it to avoid confusion and chaos later. For demonstration purposes, we plan to call our user IDs by IT for issue tracking, and then some form of the editing permissions that user has. Just whatever you do, make sure that you can remember the user ID later when you want to use it to sign in. Next, because we want to make sure our developer user can access any and all forms for which IT Vendor Dev is licensed, we will make this user a super user. A user description is optional, but can be useful, especially if you are using anything other than the user's full name as the user ID. The next thing we need to assign is the user's editing permissions. From the drop-down list for that field, you should notice that Vendor Developer is not one of our options. So how do we create one? A Vendor Developer is designated as such with the numeral 4 in the Editing Permissions field. Since that is not one of the drop-down list options, we must manually type it into the field. Now remember, even though we have obtained and applied a license to our Mongoose environment, we still have not assigned any licensed modules to this user. That is the next thing we must do, so click the User Modules button. We want this user to have access to all the basic core forms and IDOs, so we will first assign the MG Core Trans module to this user. But that is not the only license module our developer needs access to. We also need to assign this user ID to the MG Developer module. We select a new line for that module and select it from the drop-down list. And then, because the developer user will need to access any new forms and/or IDOs that are created, we must also assign rights to the MG User Created Forms module and the MG User Created IDOs module. Note that we are not planning to do anything with data views or with automated IDO access, so we do not need to grant the vendor developer user access to the MG Data Views module or the MG Core Automation module, at least not at this point. The only thing that remains for this user ID then, in terms of licensing and security, is to make sure that the user has the proper authorizations. In this case, it is not a matter of making sure the user has access to any of the forms or IDOs. The super user designation takes care of that. We should note, however, that we could have granted this user access to the necessary resources by making the user ID a member of the built-in Core Forms Developer group and the Core IDOs group. However, being a super user is even more inclusive, so we'll let the developer remain a super user. But suppose that we don't want a particular user to be able to create other user IDs. This is where the other side of authorizations becomes useful. In this case, we could prevent this developer user from creating or deleting other user IDs by clicking the User Authorizations button. When the object Authorizations for User form opens, we can select the user's main form object and revoke all privileges except the read privilege. This allows the developer to see other user IDs, but that's all. Now, there are many other aspects to creating a user ID and configuring it correctly for the system. We could, for instance, configure the user's email so that this user can receive notifications via email. We could configure the user for source control, and depending on which source control system we are using, we might be required to do so. But we don't have time to cover or demonstrate all the other aspects now. We encourage you, though, to explore all the options on the Users form and use the online help to learn about the many powerful user ID features you can employ. Before we sign off, we would like to give you the opportunity to do a couple exercises designed to let you create your own user ID profiles. We recommend that you go ahead and do these exercises, as you will find it helpful to have these user IDs available once we start doing some serious form and application development work. Looking back, in this tutorial we learned about licensing and security mechanisms for Mongoose, what is included in a Mongoose license and how to apply it, assigning licensed modules to users, editing permissions and what they mean for users, individual and group authorizations and what they mean for users. And we showed you how to create a user ID profile before giving you the chance to create one yourself. So, what's next? In the next tutorial in this series, we will begin to look at the major features of the Mongoose user interface, including navigation and other tips and tricks for getting the most out of your Mongoose user experience. For more information, including more tutorials and complete documentation, visit our Mongoose portal at https://mongoose.infor.com/portal. For technical support, visit the Infor Extreme support website at https://www.inforextreme.com and log an incident there. Or feel free to contact us with your questions and comments at mongoose@infor.com. That's it for this tutorial. Until next time then, have a great Mongoose day!